On the night my only daughter turned 45, I walked into her home carrying a cake and walked out carrying a death wish. That line may sound like the beginning of some family betrayal thriller on television, but it was my life, my reality, and the wound that still burns inside me. I am Clara Mitchell, 72 years old, a mother who once believed that unconditional love and endless sacrifice could buy gratitude, closeness, and family warmth. What I received instead was betrayal so cold that even now, years later, the words still echo like knives in my chest. This is not just another story. It is a revenge story, born out of heartbreak, a true example of how mother's sacrifice can be twisted into a weapon against her. That afternoon, I arrived at Sophie's house early, holding a chocolate cake with strawberries from her favorite bakery. $200 expensive for me, but nothing felt too much for my only child. I had decorated it with candles, already imagining the glow reflecting in her eyes, the way it used to when she was little. I rehearsed the words in my head, "Happy birthday, my love." I knocked at the door with a smile on my face, expecting laughter hugs, maybe even a moment of warmth in the middle of all her busyness. But when the door opened, my smile collapsed. Sophie didn't look at me like a daughter looks at a mother. Her eyes carried annoyance, impatience, as if my very presence was an inconvenience. She muttered, "Oh, it's you." No joy, no gratitude, just a sigh that told me I was not welcome. Still, I held out the cake with trembling hands and whispered, "Happy birthday, sweetheart. I brought your favorite, just like when you were a little girl." She let me in, but her voice was sharp, her tone filled with distance. We sat in her living room, the very home I had helped finance years ago. The silence was heavy, unnatural. Then she looked me straight in the eye, and with the cruelest calm I have ever witnessed, she spoke. "The one thing I'd love most as a birthday present is for you to just die." The world froze. My heart stopped. I heard those words replay in my mind, each syllable pounding like thunder. This was not a random insult. It was the truth of how my daughter saw me, not as a mother, not as a woman who had given up decades of her life for her happiness, but as a burden she wanted erased. I felt a chill crawl through my bones, a wave of nausea rise from my stomach. In that instant, I realized I was no longer just a mother. I was the victim of toxic daughter syndrome, the casualty of a silent war inside a family, the living proof of what so many women endure, but rarely dare to confess. This is not only my family betrayal, it is also the beginning of my late life rebirth. Because sometimes, when the people you love most wish for your end, the only answer is to start a new beginning. I sat there in Sophie's living room with the cake still in my lap, the candles melting like the fragments of hope inside me. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her, that my daughter had not just told me her greatest birthday wish was for me to die. But her eyes, sharp as glass, told me she meant every word. The silence that followed was even louder than the cruelty of her voice. Mark, my son-in-law, sat across from us, on the other sofa. He heard everything. He looked up from his phone, then looked down again, pretending the conversation did not involve him. His silence was not neutral. It was an alliance with her. In that instant, I realized I was completely alone in a house I had paid for, surrounded by people who benefited from my sacrifices, but saw me as nothing more than an intruder. Sophie crossed her arms and leaned back, her body language screaming contempt. She exhaled loudly, as if my presence polluted the air she was trying to breathe. "I'm suffocating with you always here, Mom," she said. "You call too often, you drop by unannounced. You always want to be part of everything. I need freedom. I need space. You're draining me." Her words sliced me open. Here I was, a 72-year-old woman who had spent her entire life pouring love into this girl, only to hear that my love had turned into poison in her eyes. I wanted to argue to defend myself, to shout that everything I had ever done had been for her. But my throat tightened. The cake felt heavier in my hands. The candles dripped wax onto the frosting, as if mocking the tears burning in my eyes. I whispered, "Sophie, I'm your mother. I gave you everything. I sacrificed everything for you." But she cut me off, her voice sharp, almost mocking. "Exactly. And that's the problem. You suffocate me with your sacrifices. You never did it for me. You did it to feel important, to feel needed, to control me. I'm not your little girl anymore, Mom. Stop clinging to me like I'm all you have." Family betrayal has many faces. Sometimes it comes in silence, sometimes in abandonment. But the most devastating form is when your own child looks you in the eye and tells you that your existence itself is a burden. I felt as if the floor had vanished beneath me. 45 years of mother's sacrifice, reduced to nothing but accusations of control. I turned my head toward Mark, hoping, begging silently for him to intervene, to say something, anything that would soften the cruelty. But he kept his eyes down, scrolling through his phone, as if the moment was too inconvenient to acknowledge. His silence screamed louder than Sophie's words. He was complicit. He was comfortable with my humiliation, because as long as I remained the financial safety net, he never had to take full responsibility for his own family. The betrayal wasn't just in Sophie's words. It was in Mark's cowardice. Inside, my thoughts spiraled. I remembered the down payment of $150,000 I had pulled from my retirement savings to buy this very house. I remembered the 8 months of mortgage payments I had covered when Mark lost his job, the $16,000 that left me eating beans and rice while they dined in restaurants. I remembered holding Sophie in my arms as a baby when pneumonia almost stole her away, working 3 shifts in the hospital just to pay for wildly $200 worth of medicine not covered by insurance. And now, that same child, now a woman grown, looked at me with eyes of steel and said her life would be better if I disappeared. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the cake on the floor, to smash the candles against the wall, to make them feel even a fraction of the pain they had just stabbed into me. But I couldn't. I sat frozen, a statue of heartbreak, my pulse pounding in my ears. Sophie's voice continued cold and dismissive. "Go live your own life, Mom. Stop clinging to me like I owe you something. I'm tired of the drama, the guilt trips, the emotional needs. I don't want to be your world anymore. I want to breathe without you choking me." Her rejection was absolute. It was not anger in the heat of the moment. It was the crystallized truth of how she saw me. And Mark's silence confirmed it. They didn't want me here, not in the house, not in their lives, maybe not even on this earth. I stared at the cake, at the frosting I had chosen so carefully, at the strawberries she used to beg me for as a child. It was no longer a gift. It was a symbol of mockery, a monument to wasted love. The room blurred as tears filled my eyes. I forced myself to stand my knees, trembling under the weight of despair. I turned to leave whispering, "Happy birthday, Sophie." My voice cracked the words almost inaudible. But Sophie didn't chase after me. She didn't apologize. She didn't even flinch. She only tapped her fingers on her crossed arms, impatient for me to leave so she could enjoy her birthday without the nuisance of her mother. Mark cleared his throat but said nothing, his eyes glued to his phone screen, as if my heartbreak was invisible. When I stepped out of that house, the air felt different, colder, heavier. I had walked into that home as a mother full of love, and I walked out as a woman carrying the ashes of betrayal. That night, I understood the real definition of a toxic daughter. A child who takes everything, demands everything, and then despises you for giving too much. I stood by my car, clutching the cake, unable to breathe, unable to think, my heart collapsing under the weight of Sophie's words. And though I didn't know it then, this was the exact moment when my revenge story was born, not out of hatred, but out of survival. Because when your own child tells you that your existence is a burden, you realize that survival means creating a new existence that no one can take away. A few days passed after that birthday disaster, and the wound was still fresh. I told myself I would never step back into Sophie's life again, never let her words haunt me beyond that night. But then just when the silence began to feel heavy, the phone rang. It was her number. For a second, my heart leapt foolishly, hoping she might apologize, that she might take back the cruelty she had thrown at me. I picked up my voice, trembling with the hope. But instead of remorse, I heard the same coldness as always. "Mom, I need a favor." That was it. No greeting, no tenderness, no acknowledgement of the knife she had stuck in my heart days before. Just another demand, another obligation disguised as family connection. This is the cruelest form of family betrayal, not just rejection, but exploitation, cloaked in the mask of love. Sophie never called to ask how I was doing. She never visited me to share coffee or laugh about old memories. She only dialed my number when she needed something. If it wasn't money for the mortgage, it was babysitting Ella and Noah, or running errands she didn't want to handle. She knew I was always available, always desperate for crumbs of affection, and she used that desperation like a leash around my neck. I remember one particular night. Sophie had a dinner with Mark, some important event for his career, though he was unemployed again at the time. She called me hours before Mom. "Can you watch the twins tonight? It's really important." My chest tightened. After all she had said to me after wishing me dead as her birthday gift, she still had the audacity to ask me to step in like nothing happened. And here's the most painful part. I almost said yes. My lips parted with the word, because part of me still longed to feel needed, still longed to hold on to some piece of her life. But then I caught myself. I remembered the candles melting on that $200 cake while she told me I was suffocating her. I remembered the impatience in her eyes as she waited for me to leave. My voice cracked, but I said, "I can't, Sophie. I have other plans." For the first time in years, I told her no. The silence on the line was deafening. Then came her scoff, sharp and bitter. "Other plans? Since when do you have plans? You're 72, Mom. What could possibly be more important than helping your family?" That sentence revealed everything in her eyes. I wasn't a person. I was a service, a free babysitter, an ATM with emotions. Nothing more. It wasn't just babysitting. There were countless other moments when she cloaked her manipulation in fake affection. She would call me Mommy in that sugary tone only when asking for money. "Mommy, the kids really need braces." "Mommy, Mark lost his job again. We're short on the mortgage this month." "Mommy, could you buy the groceries just this once?" And each time I gave in, she rewarded me with a thank you. Text full of emojis, like tossing crumbs to a starving bird. But the next day, the coldness returned. No warmth, no real gratitude. Just more demands. Mark was no different. He rarely spoke to me directly, but his silence was its own form of approval. Whenever I stepped into their house with bags of food, he would nod slightly, sometimes mutter a quick thanks, and then disappear into another room. He never stopped Sophie from speaking to me like I was a burden. He never reminded her that I had saved their home with my pension money, or that I had financed their dream wedding. He was content as long as I kept filling the gaps in their lives, like plaster in a crumbling wall. Even my grandchildren, sweet as they were, had been drawn unknowingly into this performance. "Grandma, can you buy us new sneakers? Grandma, can you come to the school, play?" Their requests were innocent, but behind their voices, I could hear Sophie orchestrating it, reminding them that Grandma was the reliable one. Grandma would always pay, always show up, always cancel her own plans. The children loved me, I don't doubt that. But Sophie had turned that love into another lever of control, fake. Love is more painful than open hatred because it tricks your heart into hoping. Each time Sophie smiled at me sweetly while sliding another bill across the table, each time she hugged me before handing me a list of favors, I felt that false hope. Maybe this time she really loves me. Maybe this time she sees me as her mother again. But it was always a lie. The warmth evaporated the moment the need was satisfied. I started noticing the pattern. Every interaction began with ice, then a sudden flicker of sweetness, then the reveal of the real reason, money babysitting errands. It was like clockwork, a manipulative dance that I had rehearsed for decades without realizing it. And each time I played my role, smiling, nodding, handing over what she wanted, all while my own needs withered in the shadows. One evening, my neighbor Margaret Lewis stopped by while I was returning from Sophie's house, my arms full of grocery bags I had bought for them. She shook her head and said softly, "Clara, you look exhausted. You give them everything, but do they ever give back?" Her words pierced me because deep down, I already knew the answer. Sophie's affection was a mask she wore only when she wanted something. The rest of the time, she treated me like I was disposable. This was emotional abuse packaged as family duty. This was family betrayal at its most insidious: smiles, hiding daggers, hugs, hiding chains. And that night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I whispered to myself a truth I had avoided for too long. My daughter doesn't love me. She loves what I can do for her. That realization was the seed of transformation. The betrayal wasn't just in her cruel birthday wish. The betrayal was in every false smile, every empty hug, every fake thank you that concealed a demand. And I knew then that my revenge story would not be about shouting back or punishing them. My revenge would be something far greater: freedom. A late life rebirth where I would no longer live as their servant, but as myself. That night, after Sophie's cold request for my death, I sat alone in my small apartment, the cake already discarded in the trash, the candles melted into a puddle of useless wax. My chest hurt, as though every memory of motherhood had turned into a stone pressing down on me. I sank into the old sofa where I once nursed Sophie as a baby, and the floodgates of memory opened. Every sacrifice, every dollar, every sleepless night came rushing back, not as proof of love, but as evidence of how I had destroyed myself for nothing. I remembered Sophie at 3 years old, lying in a hospital bed with pneumonia, her little chest struggling to rise and fall. The doctor said she needed antibiotics immediately, but insurance wouldn't cover the $1 or $200 bill. I sold my late mother's jewelry, precious pieces that carried family history, just to save her life. I worked triple shifts at the hospital, sometimes collapsing into bed with my shoes still on. Back then, I thought this is what love means, giving until it hurts. But now, decades later, that child I saved told me my existence was an inconvenience. Then came the teenage years. Sophie was 16 and obsessed with prom, desperate to wear the pink dress displayed in the boutique window. $800 was a mountain for me back then, but I took extra weekend shifts for 4 straight months. I remember the sparkle in her eyes when she twirled in front of the mirror whispering, "Thank you, Mom. You're the best in the world." I held onto that hug like it was gold. But standing in my apartment years later, I realized those words had faded into dust. Gratitude was temporary. Demands were eternal. College was another battlefield. Sophie changed her major 3 times each switch, costing more tuition, more fees, more of my blood and sweat. In total, $42,000 vanished from my savings. I took out a second mortgage on my house, promising myself it was worth it because her education mattered more than my retirement. I told her, "Don't worry, honey. Your dreams are the most important thing." What a cruel irony that I invested in her future only to be erased from it. Then came her wedding. $35,000, the most elegant ballroom in the city. Flowers, music, food, all chosen without concern for the bill. I signed check after a check, smiling through my exhaustion, telling myself my princess deserved everything. When Sophie walked down the aisle, radiant and adored, I felt like my sacrifices had blossomed into beauty. But now I know I wasn't building her happiness. I was building my own prison, brick by brick. The most devastating memory of all was the house. Sophie and Mark wanted to buy their first property, and without hesitation, I emptied $150,000 from my life savings, the money meant to secure my old age. I told them, "Don't worry about the down payment, I'll take care of it." At the time, I believed I was cementing my place in their lives, ensuring they would always remember who gave them stability. But instead of gratitude, they built walls to keep me out. That very house, the one I sacrificed my future for, became the place where Sophie looked me in the eye and said her life would be easier if I were dead. The memories kept coming like waves, crashing on rocks. The nights I babysat Ella and Noah for free, rearranging my own schedule so Sophie could go out with Mark. The 8 months of mortgage payments I covered when Mark lost his job, $16,000 taken from my pension, leaving me to stretch rice and beans just to survive. The $4,000 for braces, the countless birthday and Christmas gifts that added up to at least $10,000 more. When I tallied everything, the number was staggering, nearly $500,000 over the course of her life. $500,000 spent on love that now counted for nothing. But the money wasn't the worst part. The real wound was realizing how blind I had been. For decades, I mistook dependency for closeness. I believed that if I kept giving, Sophie would see me as her anchor, her hero, her safe place. Instead, she saw me as a resource, a tool, a background character in her own life story. Love had been replaced by entitlement, and my devotion had been twisted into chains around my own neck. As I sat in the dim light of my apartment, I looked at the boxes of receipts and documents I had kept all these years. I used to treasure them as proud reminders of everything I had provided. Now I saw them for what they were, evidence of my self-destruction. If I had put that money into savings with interest, I would have over $600,000 today, enough to live comfortably, to travel, to enjoy the last chapter of my life in peace. Instead, I had invested in a toxic daughter who saw my love as suffocation and my presence as a curse. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered to myself, how did I end up here? How did a lifetime of sacrifice turn into rejection? The truth was brutal but undeniable. I had confused sacrifice with love, control with care, hope with reality. Sophie didn't want me. She wanted what I gave her. And now that I had nothing left to give, she wanted me gone. That realization burned like fire, but it also illuminated something I hadn't seen before. Perhaps the problem wasn't only Sophie. Perhaps the problem was me for believing that endless giving would guarantee endless love. That night, lying awake until dawn, I saw the truth with terrifying clarity. My daughter's betrayal was real, but so was my complicity. I had built my own cage, and now I had to find the strength to break free. The morning after drowning in memories of sacrifice, I woke with a different fire burning inside me. The grief was still there, yes, but beneath it, something new had begun to rise. Clarity, indignation, determination. For 72 years, I had lived as a servant of love, sacrificing every coin, every dream, every ounce of energy for my daughter. And what did I receive? A death wish on her birthday. If Sophie wanted me to disappear, then I would, but not in the way she expected. My disappearance would be her punishment and my rebirth. I put on my best clothes that morning, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to remind myself I was not broken. My first destination was the bank. There was a joint account I had opened years ago, meant for emergencies on Sophie's house. $20,000 sat in that account untouched, waiting for the next crisis she would bring me. I walked up to the manager, Mr. Brown, a man who had known me for decades. He smiled kindly. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell. How can I help you today?" I smiled back, but this time my smile carried steel. "I want to close joint account number 45728 and transfer all funds to my personal account." He blinked in surprise. "Are you sure that's a considerable balance?" My voice was steady. "I am completely sure." Signing those papers felt like cutting the first chain off my body. $20,000 returned to my name. 20,000 reasons to breathe freely again. Next, I walked to the mortgage office. Just last year, when Mark lost his job, I had co-signed their loan to keep them afloat. At the time, I thought it was love, protection, safety. Now I saw it for what it was: leverage. Being a co-signer didn't just make me responsible, it gave me rights. The loan officer, Ms. Davis, handed me a thick folder. She explained, "As a co-signer, you're liable for payments if the primary holders default, but you also have the right to claim ownership if financial instability is proven." I almost laughed. Sophie had handed me the evidence herself, telling me Mark had lost his job again. Bragging without realizing she was handing me the rope that would tighten around her neck. I slipped copies of every document into my bag. If they couldn't handle responsibility, then I would take back what was rightfully mine. By the time I stepped out of that office, my stride felt different. For the first time in decades, I wasn't just reacting to Sophie's cruelty. I was building my own revenge story. A revenge not of violence or shouting, but of logic, law, and liberation. This was not about hurting her. This was about reclaiming me. My third stop was the office of Edward Clark, my lawyer, and an old friend of my late husband. When I walked in, he looked surprised. "Clara, what brings you here?" I sat down across from him, my voice calm but sharp. "I want to change everything: my will, my life insurance, every document that mentions Sophie's name." Edward listened as I poured out the whole story: how Sophie wished for my death, how her love had turned into contempt, how decades of sacrifice had been spat on. His eyes darkened with sympathy, but also respect. "You've made your decision?" then he asked. I nodded. "Yes. I want everything transferred. My apartment, my savings, my $100,000 life insurance. All of it goes to the Orphans Foundation, and I want a trust fund for Ella and Noah, but Sophie cannot touch it until they are 25. For hours, we worked through every detail. Each signature I placed on those documents felt like stitching a wound shut. Sophie had wanted my death, fine. When I did die, she would get nothing. Not a penny. Her birthday wish had become my gift to myself, the freedom to ensure she could never exploit me again. But my plan wasn't just about money, it was about freedom. That afternoon, back at my apartment, I pulled out a phone number I had saved for months, but never dared to dial. It belonged to a travel agency specializing in retirees who wanted to live abroad. My voice didn't shake when I spoke, "Good evening. This is Clara Mitchell. I'd like information on permanent living programs in Switzerland. Switzerland Neutral Safe Beautiful. A place where I could vanish from Sophie's reach and finally live for myself." The agent promised to send me options from short stays to permanent residency. My chest lifted with anticipation I hadn't felt in years. I shared my plan with my neighbor, Margaret Lewis. She had seen me rushing back and forth, always carrying groceries or babysitting bags, always drained. When I told her Sophie's words, her eyes filled with tears. "Clara, that's unforgivable. If you're going to disappear, let me help. I'll be your witness, your messenger. I'll tell Sophie when the time comes." Her solidarity gave me strength. We plotted carefully. She would find my apartment empty, deliver my farewell letter, and watch Sophie crumble under the weight of consequences. As the sun set that day, I looked around my small apartment with new eyes. The walls were still cracked, the furniture old, but for the first time, it felt like a fortress, a headquarters for my liberation. The grief had not vanished, but it had transformed. Grief had become a weapon. Betrayal had become a blueprint. And love had finally turned inward toward myself. By the end of the week, my bank accounts were secure. My will rewritten, my legal documents armored against challenge, and my travel plans in motion. For the first time in 45 years, I wasn't Sophie's mother first. I was Clara Mitchell, a woman with dignity, with agency, with a future. Sophie thought she had crushed me, but she had only awakened me. And as I sipped a glass of wine that evening, something I hadn't done in decades, I whispered to myself, "This isn't the end of me. This is the beginning." The morning of my departure arrived with a quiet kind of triumph. I carried 2 suitcases down the stairs of my old apartment, each filled not with burdens, but with freedom. Margaret, my neighbor and loyal accomplice, stood at the door holding the spare keys and the envelope that contained my 23-page farewell letter. We embraced, and she whispered, "Are you ready for the performance of a lifetime?" I smiled. Ready isn't the word. I was born for this moment. When the cab arrived, I didn't look back at the cracked walls or the worn sofa. That apartment had been a cage of sacrifice. Now it was the launch pad of my escape. The flight to Zurich was long, but every mile between me and Sophie felt like oxygen filling my lungs. For the first time in years, no one could call me to beg for money. No one could drop children at my door. No one could sneer that I was suffocating their life. I was gone just as Sophie wished, but the disappearance was on my terms. Meanwhile, back in the city, I had left behind. The dominoes began to fall. 2 days later, Margaret used the spare keys to enter my apartment. She found it empty, just as planned, and on the table sat the envelope addressed to Sophie. Inside was the detailed record of every dollar, every sacrifice, every choice that proved I had been her backbone for decades. "You wanted me gone," I had written. "Now you will learn the price of living without me." When Margaret delivered the letter, Sophie's reaction was exactly as I imagined. Panic, shock, desperation. She called my phone 30 times in one afternoon. When I finally answered, I was sitting on a bench by Lake Zurich, watching the water ripple under the Alps. Her voice cracked with hysteria. "Mom, where are you? Margaret says you left. What is this letter? You can't be serious." My tone was calm, deliberate, each word a knife of truth. Did you read it, Sophie? Did you see what I sacrificed for you? Did you see the cost of your contempt? She stammered excuses. I didn't mean what I said on my birthday. I was stressed. I was frustrated. Please, just come home. But I wasn't fooled. I heard it in her voice, the fear of losing her provider, not the fear of losing her mother. So I asked the question that sliced away all pretenses. Do you miss me, Sophie, or do you miss my money? Her silence confirmed everything. The fallout spread quickly. Within a week, the bank called Sophie and Mark to notify them that as co-signers who had already defaulted before their house was now under review. The lawyer, Edward Clark, filed the legal documents I had signed reclaiming my rights. Sophie's anger turned to desperation. She confronted Margaret in the street, screaming that I was ruining her life. Neighbors gathered their whispers, cutting sharper than knives. For years, they had seen me trudging back and forth with groceries, with tired eyes and bent shoulders. Now the truth was laid bare. The daughter they thought was so successful had been living off her mother's sacrifice. Sophie tried to fight back, but her moves only exposed her further. She went to social services and filed a complaint claiming I had dementia, that I was being manipulated, that I wasn't capable of making these decisions. But when the American consulate in Switzerland arranged a medical and psychological evaluation, the results were undeniable. I was in perfect mental health, fully lucid, fully aware. The only manipulation came from her. The report officially documented that Sophie's claims were false, a desperate attempt to regain financial control. The humiliation didn't stop there. At a neighborhood gathering, Margaret told others about the letter Sophie had received. She didn't share every word, but she revealed enough that I had spent nearly $500,000 on Sophie over the years, that I had covered mortgages, tuition braces, weddings, and more. The story spread like wildfire. Neighbors who once envied Sophie's lifestyle now saw it for what it was, a castle built on her mother's broken back. Sophie's mask of success crumbled. Mark wasn't spared either. When people learned he had allowed his wife to speak to me with such cruelty while enjoying the benefits of my money, his reputation collapsed. He could no longer hide behind silence. His colleagues whispered, his friends distanced themselves. For once, the shame wasn't mine, it was theirs. From Zurich, I watched it all unfold through phone calls with Margaret and updates from Edward. Sophie's frantic texts flooded my phone. "Mom, please, I'm sorry. We can fix this. The kids are asking for you." But I knew better. Every apology was a strategy, every plea a mask. None of it came from love. It came from fear of losing the life I had built for her. The climax came when the foreclosure notice arrived. Margaret told me Sophie collapsed on the porch, sobbing while neighbors watched. For years, I had collapsed silently, hidden in my apartment, crying over exhaustion and loneliness. Now, Sophie's tears were public. The world could finally see the truth I had carried alone. The daughter who demanded my death was helpless without me. And yet, even in that moment of poetic justice, my heart ached not for Sophie, but for the children. Ella and Noah hadn't asked for this. They were innocent, trapped in a cycle they didn't create. That was why I had set up the trust fund, why my revenge was never about destroying them, but about protecting myself while leaving them a future. Standing on the balcony of my new apartment in Zurich, the Alps rising in the distance, I whispered to the wind, "The truth is out, Sophie. You wanted me gone, and now you know what gone truly means." The call came from Margaret one crisp morning, her voice trembling with excitement. "Clara, it's done. The bank foreclosed on Sophie and Mark's house last week. They've moved into a small apartment across town." For a moment, silence filled the line. as I tried to absorb it. The house, the one I had poured $150,000 of my retirement savings into, the one where Sophie had told me her greatest wish was my death, was no longer theirs. Justice had arrived, not with fire or fury, but with cold, undeniable consequence. Margaret continued, "They're struggling, Clara. Mark finally got a job in a factory, but it pays much less. Sophie's had to go back to work, and she complains constantly about how hard life is without your help." I closed my eyes and let out a long breath. I didn't feel joy at their suffering, at least not the way people imagine revenge feels. Instead, I felt something deeper satisfaction, that the balance had finally shifted, that the scales of family betrayal had at last tipped toward justice. In Switzerland, my life had blossomed in ways I never imagined possible. Edward called soon after Margaret informing me that because I was co-signer, I was entitled to recover my initial investment, plus interest from the foreclosure. "Clara," he said, "you'll be receiving $185,000 in your Swiss account by the end of the week." Days later, another call brought more news my apartment back home had sold, and after commissions, I had $95,000 more to add to my new life. When the numbers settled, my net worth had crossed over $500,000. At 72, after years of eating beans and rice to stretch my pension, I was wealthier than I had ever been. The woman Sophie had tried to erase was now financially free, independent, and untouchable. And it wasn't just the money. It was the dignity. I no longer jumped every time the phone rang, no longer waited for scraps of affection wrapped around demands. In Zurich, I spent mornings walking by the lake, afternoons in watercolor classes, evenings in German lessons, where my classmates, other women and men, my age, laughed with me like I was their equal, not their servant. For the first time in my adult life, my calendar was filled with things I chose, not obligations forced upon me. Meanwhile, Sophie's facade crumbled. Margaret told me neighbors whispered about her in the supermarket, shaking their heads. She treated her mother like dirt, one said. Now look where it got her. The very community that once admired her lifestyle now saw the truth. It had all been funded by mother's sacrifice, by the very woman she had discarded. Her reputation was destroyed, not by my words, but by her own actions. Mark, too, bore the weight of exposure. His friends no longer respected him. His colleagues treated him like a failure, and the silence he once used as a shield now branded him as weak and complicit. Their life, once cushioned by my sacrifices, was stripped bare, forcing them to face reality without me as their safety net. For me, the transformation was complete. One evening, as I sat at my favorite cafe overlooking Lake Zurich, sipping French wine, I had bought without hesitation. I realized something profound. I had not only escaped emotional abuse, I had reclaimed my identity. For decades, I had been Sophie's mother, defined by her needs, her whims, her cruelty. Now I was Clara Mitchell again, a woman with her own story, her own dignity, her own freedom. I invested part of my recovered money in Swiss bonds, guided by a financial advisor who treated me with respect. He showed me projections that promised my wealth would only grow. In 5 years, "Clara, you could double this," he told me. I smiled. For once, I'll let the future work for me instead of against me. That was the essence of my late life rebirth. I had turned every dollar Sophie wasted into seeds for my own flourishing. Did Sophie regret? Perhaps. Margaret told me she cried often, that she even asked neighbors if anyone knew how to contact me. But by then, her tears meant little. They were not tears for me. They were tears for her lost privileges, her shattered illusions. True remorse is shown through change, and Sophie had shown none. Her sorrow came not from love, but from loss of control. And yet I did not gloat. Revenge, I learned, is not about dancing on the ruins of your enemy. It is about standing tall in your own rebuilt life. Every morning, I looked in the mirror and whispered, "You did it, Clara. You survived the betrayal. You rose from the ashes. You are free." The greatest consequence of all wasn't Sophie losing her house or Mark losing his pride. It was me reclaiming my soul. I had been buried under decades of sacrifice, smothered by the label of toxic daughter's mother. Now I walked in the light of my own worth. That was the true justice, not their downfall, but my rise. It had been nearly 2 years since I stepped onto that plane and left my old life behind. By then, I had become someone new, someone whole again. Switzerland was no longer a temporary refuge. It was home. My days were filled with the rhythm of freedom painting classes, hikes in the Alps evenings spent with friends who knew me not as a desperate mother clinging to an ungrateful daughter, but as Clara Mitchell, a woman with dignity and laughter still in her veins. Yet even as I thrived, there was a quiet ache that lingered. Not for Sophie, no, that bridge was ash and smoke, but for Ella and Noah, my grandchildren, the only innocent hearts caught in the storm of this family betrayal. One spring morning, as the sun poured over my balcony and painted the mountains in gold, I opened my mailbox and froze. Among bills and advertisements was an envelope marked with handwriting I recognized instantly. It was uneven, childlike, and careful. My hands trembled as I opened it, and there in the unmistakable scrawl of my grandchildren were the words that pierced me deeper than any legal battle or cruel insult ever could. "Dear Grandma, Clara, Dad told us the truth. He told us that Mom said ugly things to you, and that's why you left. We want you to know that we miss you so much. We love you, and we are proud of you for being so brave. When we are older, we want to visit you in Switzerland. Love, Ella and Noah." Inside the envelope were drawings me standing by tall mountains, smiling with the two of them holding my hands. My heart cracked open, and tears spilled down my face. For the first time in years, I cried not from pain, but from healing. Those little words, scribbled in pencil, gave me something Sophie never could: acknowledgement, love, without conditions, admiration, without strings attached. They were too young to understand the depth of the betrayal, but they understood enough. They knew their grandmother had been hurt. They knew I had chosen a different life. And instead of condemning me, they honored my courage. I held that letter against my chest for a long time, whispering their names like a prayer. Ella, Noah. The 2 reasons I had once endured endless babysitting and sacrifice. The 2 reasons I had cried when I thought I might never see them again. Now, through their own words, they reached across the distance Sophie had built and gave me a bridge not to reconciliation with her, but to love that still lived in their hearts. That evening, I sat at my desk overlooking Lake Zurich and wrote my reply. My hands shook as I formed each word careful and deliberate. "My dearest Ella and Noah, your letter is the most beautiful gift I have received in years. I love you deeply and always will, no matter the distance. You must know this: my choice to live far away does not mean I stopped loving you. It means I had to protect myself so I could survive. When you are older and free to make your own choices, the doors to my heart and my home will always be open for you. Until then, know that your grandma is happy, healthy, and living a life full of peace." Learn from this. My love's words have power. They can build or they can destroy. Use your words to build love and respect in your lives. As I sealed the envelope, I felt a profound shift inside me. This was not reconciliation with Sophie, but it was a thread of healing, tied through her children. They were proof that love could survive beyond betrayal, that even in the ashes of a broken family, something tender could grow. Weeks later, Margaret called to tell me she had seen Sophie at the market, dragging her children behind her, looking worn and bitter. Sophie had asked if anyone had heard from me, and when Ella and Noah mentioned writing me a letter, Sophie's face twisted with anger. But Margaret smiled as she told me the children defended you. They told her you were brave, that you deserved happiness. You should have seen it, Clara. Even Sophie couldn't silence them. Hearing that filled me with quiet pride. My grandchildren had chosen love over manipulation, truth over silence. They saw me not as Sophie painted me, a burden, a nuisance, a suffocating mother, but as who I truly was, a woman who loved them fiercely, even from afar. This was the indirect reconciliation I never expected. Not forgiveness for Sophie, but love, preserved through the next generation. And it reminded me why I had left in the first place. If I had stayed, if I had continued to bend under Sophie's cruelty, Ella and Noah would have learned that abuse was normal, that taking advantage of love was acceptable. But by walking away, by reclaiming my dignity, I had given them a different lesson, that respect matters, that self-worth matters, that even in the face of betrayal, you can rise and choose freedom. That night, I placed their letter in a wooden box on my dresser, a box where I kept only the most sacred pieces of my life. It joined the few photographs of my late husband, a small locket from my mother, and a notebook filled with reflections from my journey. I whispered, "Thank you, Ella and Noah. You have given me back the piece of my heart I thought was gone forever." For the first time since Sophie's cruel words on her birthday, I felt whole. The wound still existed, but it no longer bled. It had become a scar, a reminder of pain survived and love reclaimed in the most unexpected way. Today, as I sit on the balcony of my apartment in Zurich, I look out over the snow-capped Alps and feel the sunlight warming my face. The same woman who once carried bags of groceries for an ungrateful daughter now carries nothing but peace. I sip my coffee slowly, not rushing, not worrying about a phone call, demanding money, or a sudden cry for babysitting. For the first time in my life, my time belongs to me. My disappearance was never about revenge. It was about rebirth. It was not punishment. It was liberation. When Sophie wished for my death, she thought she was cursing me. In truth, she set me free. I left behind not only her house and her cruelty, but also the chains I had wrapped around my own heart for decades. And here, thousands of miles away, I found something I never expected myself. I discovered that dignity is not given, it is taken back. Freedom is not granted, it is chosen. Many people believe that walking away is weakness. I am proof that walking away can be the strongest act of all. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is vanish from the place that destroys you and appear again in the place that restores you. I did not die as Sophie wished. I was reborn as Clara, whole, free, and unbroken. And this is what I want you, listening to my story, to understand. If you are drowning in betrayal, if love in your family has turned into chains, you are not powerless. You are not trapped. You can choose freedom, even if it means letting go of the people you thought would love you forever. Your worth is not measured by how much you give to those who take. It is measured by the courage you show when you finally say, enough. So I ask you now, what would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed suffocating in the poison of a toxic daughter? Or would you have chosen to rise, as I did, into a new life? Tell me in the comments below, because your voice matters here. And if my story touched something inside, you don't let it fade. Save this video, share it with someone who needs strength, and subscribe for more stories of survival and rebirth. Because sometimes the only way to win the battle of family betrayal is not to fight, but to walk away and be reborn.